my son lives in Israel and works with the International Committee of the Red Cross. When the Hamas missiles were being fired at Tel Aviv, he was messaging us that he and his wife were okay in their tiny, safe room. His dog was totally distressed. My son goes down regularly to the Sderot and the other places on the Gaza border for the Red Cross. Why is the suffering of innocent civilians being attacked, innocent Israeli civilians being attacked, and the Hamas being ignored?
Randa, Abdel Fattah.
I'm so happy that your son has a safe house to go to. If only Gazans had the opportunity to escape the most densely populated place in the entire world, and it's been under a blockade by Israel for 14 years, cut off from the rest of Palestine. It got absolutely no freedom of movement. And so when you have a military power backed and funded by the US, $3.8 billion a year, you have the state-of-the-art advanced weapons dropping bombs on civilians, and you're talking to me about the safety of Israelis? Where are Palestinians in Gaza supposed to go to? Your son's puppy, your son's dog was scared. There are children who are massacred and slaughtered. 9 Palestinian families have been wiped off the civil registry. Just yesterday, there was a tweet about that. 9 Palestinian families no longer exist, obliterated. And you're talking to me about Israeli safety? Israel has state-of-the-art weapons defence system and missile defence system. Where do Palestinians go when they are being bombarded by the IDF, by one of the most powerful nuclear powers in the world? Where is their protection? Where are the people there to protect them from that onslaught? And Israel is targeting civilians. Yes, it is targeting civilians. Israel has access to, because it is the occupier, the population registry for Palestine. So it has the names, the ages, the residential addresses of every single Palestinian in Gaza, which is why it can make a phone call to say we're going to bomb this residential tower at so-and-so time.
Randa, I'm just going to take us back to the question, though, which was about the role of Hamas and the impact on Israeli civilians. We've got a few questions on this. Dave Sharma, could I ask you for a response to that question?
Well, look, I mourn the loss of life on both sides of this conflict, innocent civilians on both sides of this conflict. Every loss of life is regrettable on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side, and many people have suffered through this conflict. In my view, needlessly, this wasn't a conflict that needed to happen.
Why did it happen?
The proximate cause was that Hamas started to fire rockets at Israeli civilian populations. And that's really, there have been 5 conflicts. Since Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, there have been at least 5 conflicts between Hamas and Israel. And they've almost one started because an Israeli soldier was kidnapped and abducted, Gilad Shalit. Many others have started because of rocket fire from Hamas. I can't understand why Hamas does this, because it knows the response, as the response of any nation would be if its own population was taking rocket fire, would be to hit back at the sources of the rocket strikes. In Australia, if we were taking rocket fire here, I expect our population would be calling our political leadership and saying, what are you doing to stop this? It's that Israel has a right to self-defence. They don't choose to initiate a conflict with Hamas. They didn't initiate this conflict with Hamas. I think it's regrettable Hamas did so, but it's been to the detriment, certainly, of the Gazan civilian population, without doubt, and the Israeli population too.
When you say Israel has a right to self-defence, what you're actually asking us to embrace as a proposition is that an occupier and a coloniser, a state that is based on a racial apartheid system...
I don't accept any of those characterisations.
Well, the most prestigious human rights organisation, Human Rights Watch, found in its report last month that Israel is practising apartheid.
To be clear, they talked about a form of apartheid. I mean, they weren't calling it an apartheid state.
Hamish, if Palestinian intellectuals, activists, lawyers have for years been recording, and Israeli human rights organisations, that Israel is a settler apartheid state. It is an apartheid state that preferences one racial group over another. It is infused in every single aspect of its legal processes, its ethnic cleansing, its depopulation processes, its military occupation, its brutal military occupation in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in Gaza, its brutal siege on Palestinians in Gaza, even it affects Palestinians in the diaspora. My father is here today. He's older than the State of Israel. He was born in 1945. He has experienced 3 Nakbas, 1948, exiled in 1967, and today the ongoing Nakba. He cannot return to his house, which is still there, because he is a Palestinian. When we return as a Palestinian, we have to go there on our Australian passport, and we're at the mercy of a soldier, a conscript, who will decide whether we can enter. He gave us 3 days the last visit. Any Jewish person in this audience today automatically has a right to return and live in my father's birthplace. Don't tell me that's not apartheid.
Jen Robinson.
I have to agree with Randa. And it's one thing, Dave, to say that Israel has the ability to respond to rocket strikes, but in such a disproportionate and indiscriminate manner. If we look at the figures, just from the most recent conflict in the past month, something like 248 Palestinians have been killed, including 66 children. Israel has been indiscriminately targeting journalists, the bombing of media organisations. This is a deliberate attack on media freedom and also the ability of the world to understand what is happening on the ground. I've been working with the International Federation of Journalists working on the issue of the targeting of journalists, and there is case after case of people wearing clear press vests being sniped in the context of the Great March. Unbelievable targeting. It is not correct to say that Israel is right and is using the appropriate use of force in response to what Hamas has been doing. This is an unlawfully occupied people who have suffered great disadvantage, discrimination and human rights violations. There is a definition under international law of apartheid. Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, other Israeli human rights groups agree that it meets that definition. And it's time that the Australian government starts taking appropriate action. I am continually embarrassed by the conduct of the Australian government at the Human Rights Council, at the Security Council, voting against every single attempt for human rights accountability for what Israel and Hamas are doing. If the Australian government is so concerned about Hamas bombings, then why did we oppose the International Criminal Court having jurisdiction to look into the crimes of both sides of the conflict?
Let's let Dave respond to that.
I don't pretend the answers are easy here, but and I'm not here as the spokesperson for Israel, for that matter. I'm here as an Australian parliamentarian who's here as a representative of Australia. But having lived in the region, I can tell you that firstly, things are not as clear-cut as they might seem. Israel has not been in Gaza since 2005. They withdrew from Gaza. Shortly after Israel withdrew, Hamas took over Gaza. Hamas is committed to, in its own charter, to the destruction of the State of Israel and to imposing Islamic law upon what was historically the territory of Palestine. They're perfectly free to do that, but they're a listed terrorist organisation. Now, in my own experience, and this is certainly true of the Palestinian political leadership in the West Bank, Fattah, they would like to have a two-state solution. They support a negotiated two-state solution, but Hamas does not in Gaza. They've never accepted Israel's right to exist. They've never agreed to abide by previous peace agreements, such as the Oslo agreements, and they've never disavowed the use of terrorism as a tool. Now, and until such time as the Palestinian political leadership can be reunified in some way, or that Hamas agrees to a political settlement to this conflict, I think it's difficult for Israel to unilaterally solve this one. I mean,
it's not a conflict between